road, open windows, beautiful one, too perfect for this world. The immediacy of mosquitoes, humidity choking breath, my beautiful singing bird. 5-year-old Kanien'kehá, crying silent, petrified tears in the back seat until the dam finally bursts. You are the breath over the ice on the lake. You are the one the grandmothers sing to through the rapids. You are the saved seeds of allies. You are the space between embraces. She's always going to remember this. You are rebellion, resistance, reimagination. Her body will remember.
Kwe sego bojo kinawaya gedagabajina denawema Kanien'kehá Nishnaabeg ogaming nadonjaba nagojawan megwado da Betasamosake Nishnaabeg Nikichinendem gibijayan nongam andaye kinawa Natawik aki Kanien'kehá territory Chimigwich Nawankoan. Hi friends. Wow, what a huge crowd. I'm so honored to be here today in Kanien'kehá territory. Natawik territory is the word for Mohawks in my language. Miigwech now into Orenda for that beautiful introduction, and thank you to all of the organizers for making this possible. And of course, thanks for coming. I'm blown away by how many people are here today. I do a variety of things in my life. I'm an artist, I'm an academic, and I'm an activist. And so for me, I have difficulty with the boundaries between art and politics and academics because they don't make sense to me or my practice of things. And so what I want to do today is share sort of 4 little vignettes from my practice and my life as a Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg. My territory, Mississauga and Nishnaabeg territory, is roughly the north shore of Lake Ontario. We're part of the much larger Nishnaabeg or Ojibwe Nation that extends around the Great Lakes and west into Manitoba. And so the stories that I want to share today come from that place, and they come from that land, and they're stories that we carry with us collectively, and we tell them through our different voices and our different sets of experiences. The first story is a very old traditional story. It's a traditional Mississauga and Nishnaabeg story. It comes from around the Rice Lake area, which is where I come from. And on one hand, it's an origin story. It's about how maple sugar or maple syrup came to Mississauga and Nishnaabeg people. But on the other hand, it's about something else altogether. My version of this story is called Kwezance Makes a Lovely Discovery. And in my language, Kwe means woman and Kwezance means little woman. So it's the name that we would use for girls. But the person in the story can be anybody and can be any gender. This is a gender that I've attached to the story because my daughter identifies as a girl, and I was wanting to tell her this in a way that would be meaningful to her. So Kwezance is out walking in the bush one day. It's Zigwan, which is the first part of spring. The lake is opening up. The snow is finally melting. She's feeling that first warmth of spring on her cheeks. Nikichinendam, she is thinking, I'm happy. Then that Kwezance who is out walking, collecting firewood for her dodome. Dodome is a word that children call their mothers, and it means my breastfeeder. So that Kwezance who is out walking, collecting firewood for her dodome, decides to sit under Nanataguk, the maple tree. Maybe she'll just stretch out. Maybe she'll have a little rest. Maybe she'll gather the firewood a little later. Oh, Nigichinendam Nogam. I'm feeling happy today, says that Kwezance. And while that Kwezens is lying down and looking up, she sees Ajidamo up in the tree. Bojo Ajidamo. I hope you had a good winter. I hope you have enough food cached. But the squirrel doesn't look up because she's already busy. She's not collecting nuts, Gawin. She's not building her nest, Gawin, not yet. She's not looking after any young, Gawin, it's too early. She's just nibbling on the bark and then doing some sucking. Nibble, nibble, suck. Nibble, nibble, suck. Nibble, nibble, suck. Kwezens is feeling a little curious, and so she does that too on one of the low branches. Nibble, nibble, suck. Nibble, nibble, suck. This stuff tastes good. It's real sweet water. Then Kwezens gets thinking, and she makes a hole in that tree, and she makes a little slide for that sweet water to run down, and she makes a little container out of birch bark, and she collects that sweet water, and she takes that sweet water home to show her mama. And that dodome is excited, and she has 300 questions. Ah, Kwezens, what is this? Where did you find it? Which tree? Who taught you how to make it? Did you put tobacco? Did you say miigwech? How fast is it dripping? Does it happen all day? Does it happen all night? Where's the firewood? Kwezens tells her dodome the story, and her mama believes every word because she is her Kwezens, and they love each other very much. Let's cook the meat in it tonight. It will be lovely sweet. Now, okay. So they cooked that meat in the sweet water, and it was lovely sweet. It was extra lovely sweet. It was even sweeter than just sweet. And the next day, Kwezens took her mama to that tree, and her mama brought Nokomis, and Nokomis brought all the aunties, and there is a very big crowd of Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg Kwewuk, and there is a very big lot of pressure. And Kwezens tells about the squirrel, and Kwezens does the nibble, nibble, suck part. And at first, there are technical difficulties, and none of it works. But Mama rubs Kwezens back. She tells Kwezens that she believes her anyway. They talk about lots of variables like heat and temperature and time. And then Jesus comes up and warms everything up, and soon it's drip, drip, drip. And those aunties go crazy, sasakwe, dancing around, hugging a bit too tight, high-kicking and high-fiving until they take it back home and they boil it up and they boil it down into sweet, sweet sugar. And ever since, every zigwan, those Michi Saagiig and Nishnaabeg Kwewuk collect that sweet water and boil it up and boil it down into that sweet, sweet sugar. All thanks to Kwezens and her lovely discovery, and to the squirrel and her precious teaching, and to those maple trees and their boundless sharing. This spring, while tapping a stand of maple trees, I remembered that this is one of my favorite stories. It's one of my favorites because nothing violent happens in it. At every turn, Kwezens is met with very basic, core Anishinaabe values: love, compassion, and understanding. She centers her day around her own freedom and joy. I imagine myself at 7 running through a stand of maples with the first warmth of spring marking my cheeks. I imagine everything good in the world. My heart, my mind, and my spirit are opened and engaged, and I feel as if I could accomplish anything. I imagine myself grasping at feelings I haven't felt before, that maybe life is so good that it is too short, that there really isn't enough time to love everything. In reality, I have to imagine myself in this situation because as a child, I don't think that I was in a similar situation. My experience of education from kindergarten to graduate school was one of coping with someone else's agenda, curriculum, and pedagogy, someone else's stories, someone who was neither interested in my well-being as a Kwezens, my connection to my homeland, my language, or my history, or my Anishinaabe intelligence. No one ever asked me if I was interested in, nor did they ask for my consent to participate in their system. So my experience of education has been one of continually being measured against a set of principles that required surrender to an assimilative colonial agenda in order to fulfill those principles. I distinctly remember being in grade 3 at a class trip to the sugar bush, and the teacher showing us 2 methods of making maple syrup. The pioneer method, which involved a black pot over an open fire and clean sap, and the Indian method, which involved large rocks in a log that were heating sap up, and the sap was filled with bark and insects and dirt and scum. And the teacher asked us which method we would prefer. And being the only Native kid in the class, and frankly a bit of a badass, I was the only one that chose the Indian method. But things are different for this Kwezens. She's already spent 7 years immersed in a nest of Anishinaabe intelligence. She already understands the importance of observation and learning from our animal teachers when she watches the squirrels so carefully and then mimics its actions. She understands embodiment and conceptual thought when she takes this observation and then applies it to her own situation by making a cut in the maple tree and using a shunt. She relies upon her own creativity to invent new technology. She patiently waits for the sap to collect. She takes that sap home and shares it with her family. And her mother, in turn, meets her daughter with love and trust. Kwezens watches as her mom uses the sap to boil the deer meat for supper. And when she tastes the deer, the sweetness, she learns about reduction. And when her mama and her go to clean the pot, she learns about how sap can be boiled into sugar. Kwezens then takes her elders to the tree, already trusting that she will be believed, that her knowledge and her discovery will be cherished, and that she will be heard. Kwezens learned a tremendous amount over this 2-day period. It was self-led, it was driven by her own curiosity and her own personal desire to learn. She learned to trust herself, her family, and her community. She learned the sheer joy of discovery. She learned how to interact with the spirit of the maple. She learned both from the land and with the land. And she learned what it felt like to be recognized, to be seen, and to be appreciated by her community. She comes to know maple sugar with the support of her family and her elders. She comes to know maple sugar in the context of love. And to me, this is what coming into wisdom within a Mississauga Anishinaabe context looks like. It takes place in the context of family, of community, of relations. It lacks overt coercion and authority, values so normalized within Western mainstream education that they're rarely even critiqued. The land, aki, is both context and process. The process of learning to know is learner-led and profoundly spiritual in nature. So coming to know is the pursuit of a whole-body intelligence, practiced in the context of freedom, and when realized collectively, it generates generations of loving, creative, innovative, self-determining, interdependent, and self-regulating, community-minded individuals. It creates communities of individuals that have the capacity to uphold and move forward our political traditions and systems of governance. Now, I'm using Kwezens' story here in the same way that it's used within Anishinaabe intelligence as a theoretical anchor whose meaning transforms over time and space within individual and collective Anishinaabe consciousness. So we're at a university and academics like to talk about theory. I thought I'd talk about theory as well. For me, I think a theory is, in its simplest form, is an explanation, right? It's an explanation for a phenomenon. And in this way, Anishinaabe stories form the theoretical basis of our intelligence. But theory also works a little differently within Anishinaabe thought. Theory has to be generated and regenerated continually through embodied practice and within each family, community, and generation of people. So theory isn't just an intellectual pursuit. It's woven with kinetics, spiritual presence, emotion. It's contextual and relational. It is intimate and personal, with individuals themselves holding the responsibility for finding and generating meaning within their own lives. So in this context, theory isn't just for academics, it's for everyone. And so we tell this story of the maple sugar to our kids from birth. Theory within this context then is generated from the ground up. Its power stems from its living resonance with individuals and collectives. Younger citizens might first just understand the literal meaning, but as they grow, they can put together the conceptual meaning, and with more experience within our knowledge system, the metaphorical meaning. And then as they continue to carry this story through their lives, they can start to apply the processes and practices in the story. When I have a problem, I'll call my aunties or my grandparents. And then meaning making becomes an inside phenomenon. After they live each stage of life through the story, and we have so many beautiful stories like this, they can then communicate their lived wisdom through 6 or 7 decades of lived experience and shifting meaning. This is how our old people teach. They are our geniuses because they know that wisdom is generated from the ground up, that meaning is for everyone, and that we are all better when we're able to derive meaning out of our lives and be our best selves. Our stories direct, inspire, and affirm an ancient code of ethics. So if you don't know what it means to be intelligent within Anishinaabe realities, then you can't see the epistemology in this story. Then you can't see the pedagogy. The conceptual meaning, the metaphor, or how this story has references to other parts of our oral tradition, or how this story is fundamentally, like all of our stories, communicating different interpretations and realizations of an Anishinaabe worldview. For me, it's critical to avoid the assumption that this story takes place in pre-colonial times or in the past, because Anishinaabe conceptualizations of time and space present an ongoing intervention to linear thinking. This story happens in various incarnations all over our territory every year in March, when the Anishinaabe return to our sugar bushes. Kwezan's presence and the web of kinship relations that she's composed of might be complicated by her fraught relationality to the tenacity of settler colonialism, but her very presence simultaneously shatters the disappearance of Indigenous women and girls from settler consciousness. She also escapes the rigidity of colonial gender binaries by having influence and agency within her family, while physically disrupting settler colonial commodification and the ownership of the land through the implicit assumption that she is supposed to be there. I am supposed to be there. Her existence is a hub of intelligent Anishinaabe relationality, and it might be threatened by land theft, by environmental contamination, by residential schools and state-run education. It might be threatened by colonial gender violence, but Kwezan's is there anyway, every year, making maple sugar, as she's always done, in a loving, compassionate reality, propelling us to recreate the circumstances within which this story takes place. She propels us to rebel against the permeance of settler colonial reality and not just dream alternatives, but to create them on the ground, in the physical world, in spite of being occupied. If we accept colonial permanence, then our rebellion can only take place within inside settler colonial reality and thought. And we also become too willing to sacrifice the context that creates and produces cultural workers like Kwezan's. What if Kwezan's accepted the permanence of settler colonialism as an unmovable reality? What if Kwezan's had no access to the sugar bush because of land dispossession, environmental contamination, or global climate change? What if the trauma and pain of ongoing settler colonial gender violence had made it impossible for for her mama to believe her, or for her mama to reach out and so gently rub her lower back at that critical point? What if that same trauma and pain prevented her aunties and elders from gathering around her and supporting her when there were technical difficulties? What if settler colonial parenting strategies positioned that child as less believable than an adult? What if Kwezans had been in a desk at school that didn't honor at its core her potential within Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg intelligence? Or she had been in an educational context where having an open heart was a liability instead of a gift? What if she hadn't been running around, exploring, experimenting, observing the squirrel, completely engaged in a Mississauga and Nishnaabeg way of knowing? What if she hadn't been on the land at all? What if Kwezans lived in a world where no one listened to girls? Or where she had been missing or murdered before she ever made it out to the sugar bush? What then? Story number 2. Story number 2 comes from the book Islands of Decolonial Love. I should say that story number 1 has now been published as part of an enormously long academic paper in the Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education Society Journal. It's available online. It's an open access journal. So if you want to look it up, you can. Story number 2 comes from the book of Islands of Decolonial Love. And this is a book of short stories that came out last year that I wrote because I was interested in exploring the nation within. Gendered colonial violence has had really devastating and horrific effects on Indigenous peoples and communities and on our intimacy. And that's a very traumatic thing because it prevents us from connecting to the ones we love the most in a good way. And when we can't do that, we end up perpetuating the system and passing along the damage to the next generation. I was also interested in the impact of colonialism on intimacy, of all different kinds of intimacy between parents and children and lovers and partners and between humans and the land and the spiritual world. But I didn't and I don't see decolonial love as sort of just the absence of colonialism. There, for me, is also a reclamation of our spectrum of genders and sexualities and sexual orientations, relationship orientations, and the concept of love itself from within Anishinaabe thought. So I didn't see decolonial love as something far off in the future that I was dreaming about, maybe someday obtaining, but I saw sort of little beautiful islands of it all over the place, and so thus the islands in the title. Oftentimes, these islands are so small that we miss them. We miss the tiny moments of life. And oftentimes, settler colonial society tries to pathologize our love and our concepts of love. So I wanted the book to explore these islands from all different angles, from lovers and parents and friends, and relationships to land and water, and to the impact that all of this has on the spirit world. And so the story that I want to share today is called She Told Him 10,000 Years of Everything. And I think that I spend a lot of time thinking about the impact of colonialism on people and on the land. But for Anishinaabe people, the spirit world is a very real and powerful and influencing force in our lives. And so I wanted to think a little bit about what it might be like for our ancestors in the spirit world watching the last 400 years unfold. The house had a makeshift feeling she should have grown out of a long time ago. Her scattered belongings were on the floor like residue. She liked to feel that she could leave at any moment just by throwing a few things into a bag. The truth was, it would take her as long as anyone else to pack up and move. But the makeshift feeling was a feeling of being one step closer to escaping. The walls, the house, the city, and she liked that. Esther's home, her real home, was among the black spruce. She missed the Labrador tea that edged the mossy bogs, the night sky that danced. Like many people from the bush, work had led her to the city, And like those same people from the bush, she wasn't motivated by money, only by responsibility. The phone rang and she stumbled to find it, tripping over toys and clothes heaped on the floor, remembering simpler times when receivers were attached to walls. She answered. Hello? Neen Esther. Neen Clarence. It was Clarence. He was taking language classes at the band office and he never missed an opportunity to practice his rudimentary Anishinaabe moan. Hi, Clarence. Anishna, my beautiful sister. I'm fine, Clarence. What's up? Clarence launched into his news report from home, rhyming off his fact-based stories like she wasn't on the other end of the phone in his best radio announcer voice. She half listened while she got dressed. And Nosh and Wilma have called it quits. Wilma's mom got the kids until she can get back on her feet. His voice trailed off, waiting for some sort of acknowledgement from Esther. Esther wasn't listening, but Clarence was undeterred. She only ever listened for one thing, and since sightings would have made the lead story, she felt safe in assuming there had been none. Another week with no detection. Hola, Clarence, that's a lot of stuff for 1 week, she said. No kidding, sis, I don't miss a thing. But I gotta go, I'm going out tonight. The sitter is already here. You? Going out? Hola, a hot date or what? Just an old friend coming through town. It's no big deal. Okay then, I'll keep you posted. Okay, bye. Esther gave the sitter her number, hugged her kids, and walked out into the cool summer air, wearing an army jacket, black t-shirt, and jeans. She rarely left those kids, protecting them like a mama bear protects their cubs. She walked down the front step, feeling too exhausted to leave the house, much less meeting her friend, but she knew that staying in wouldn't answer her questions either. Plus, this was her only chance to see him. His band was only in town tonight, and then he'd be gone for goodness knows how long. It was now, or potentially never. He wasn't actually a friend, not yet anyways. She'd never met him in person. She was supposed to interview him for the left-leaning Arts and Cultural Weekly she freelanced for when she needed the $200. She knew him only through his music. He knew her only through her writing. Her suspicions had always been aroused with him, first from his gentleness and second from his honesty. He framed everything in the good, so gentle with whatever changes he thought maybe she should make. His quiet stillness endured even when her piece was a mess hours before the deadline. But she had to be sure. She walked the 3 blocks to the bar where his band was playing. There was no lineup to get in, which was a relief because waiting in a lineup at this point in her life seemed like a failure. She told the bouncer she was on the list. He looked surprised, but found her name on it and let her in. She headed straight for the bar to get a pint in hopes that it would both warm her up and calm her down. He found her. Hey, are you Esther? He said softly. Oh, hey, hi. Nice to meet you in person, she said, shaking his hand. Yeah, nice to finally meet you in person. Totally. Maybe we can hang out a bit after the gig. I know it'll be late. That sounds wonderful. Okay, wait for me. I'll wait. She got another beer from the bar, waited for the opening act to finish and for the stage to be reset. An hour and a half later, he appeared on stage, guitar in hand. From the opening song, he seemed to focus directly on her. She tried to remember the last time she'd even been at a live music venue. Maybe the lights made everyone think the band was singing directly to them. Maybe the performers couldn't even see the audience. Maybe they could. Although Sabe appeared to be in his late 30s, he had been on Earth for much longer than that. In the old days, when only the Anishinaabeg were here, he had a different name, a gentler, kinder name. He lived among them, but he rarely revealed himself. His job in those days was like his job now. He looked after people who had gotten lost, both physically and metaphorically. His inner nature was so sweet and gentle, his fur so soft, his strength so quiet. He walked with the Anishinaabe to teach them about both sides of honesty, the power of being forthcoming with another being, and the art of cherishing another's most naked truths. Now things were different. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti, sightings like he was a UFO. She waited for him after he finished playing, past last call, past the crowd of fans surrounding him as he tried to make it to the bar to get to the last two of his free beer. The roadies started packing. The rest of the band headed for the van to relax and get high. He patiently spoke to every fan, thanking each one of them with a mixture of humility, genuine surprise, and embarrassment that only growing up in northern Manitoba can instill in a person for the rest of their lives. And then he quietly sat down on the bar stool next to hers. Hey. Hey, she responded, meeting his eyes and then dropping hers to the floor. Thanks for coming. Sorry it was an off night for us. It was lovely, she answered. Lovely. Thanks, thank you. That's really nice. I'm still sorry. I don't know what happened. What happened next is the kind of rare that happens only when certainty melts fear into nothingness. Their eyes met and no one looked away. Relief and breath poured into the space between their bodies. She pulled his body into hers, into an embrace of complete knowing, of profound acceptance. He let go of everything that he had to carry and fell into her arms. He had recognized her immediately. Although Sabe appeared to be in her late 30s, she'd been on the earth for much longer than that. In the old days when only the Anishinaabe were here, she had a different name, a gentler, kinder name. She lived among them, but she rarely revealed herself. Her job in those days was like her job now. She looked after people who had gotten lost, both physically and metaphorically. Her inner nature was so sweet and gentle, her fur so soft, her strength so quiet. She walked with the Nishnaabeg to teach them about both sides of honesty, the power of being forthcoming with another being, and the art of cherishing another's most naked truth. Now things were different. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti, sightings, like she was a UFO. They sat together, each unable to see themselves fully, but basking in the power of the other. They talked about how hard it had become, about how easy it had been in the coniferous trees of the north compared to the concrete of the cities back when they didn't even know it was easy. They talked about the loneliness of their lives, so commonplace now that each hardly noticed. They talked about the last time they had run into one of their own. When they finished their beer, and he asked if she would walk with him, they left the bar and headed west towards the river, the one that bubbles like a beating heart. They walked beside each other, feeling the energy of the other resonating, but being careful not to touch or brush arms. Why? Neither of them were sure. When they got to the river, he put his arm around her and gently circled her forehead with his finger, as if to mark her with his affection. A tear fell from her eye, hitting the ground like a heartbeat. She told him 10,000 years of everything. They held each other. The light of their Nokomis rose and then cascaded down on the river of water spreading out before them. She bathed them in her warmth and watched over them as they kissed, as their love echoed out from the riverbank in concentric circles. A night hawk flew over the water, diving through time and space head first towards the river with the full force of everything. 2 meters from the water and at the bottom of her dive, she flexed her wings upward. Air rushed through her wingtips, making a thunderous sound. So that's a story from Islands of Decolonial Love. In another part of my life, I'm involved in Indigenous struggles around land and bodies, and so I often get asked in my travels, what is it that you people want anyway? So I decided that that was a good opportunity for me to be clear. 2 winters ago, Idle No More organizers in Toronto recognized that although Indigenous peoples have been talking about nationhood for years, the idea of Indigenous nationhood is a concept that's still very misunderstood by Canadians. In response, the Toronto organizers launched a dialogue called Nation to Nation Now, The Conversations, which took place at the end of March in Toronto. They invited speakers from both the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabeg Nation to come together and share about what nationhood means to us from within our own political traditions. Wanda Nanabush moderated a discussion between myself and Anishinaabe artist Robert Houle. Robert and I were up first, and I got up very early. I live in Peterborough, Ontario, and drove into Toronto on the 401, following the north shore of Lake Ontario. As I was driving, I remembered our old stories of what the land used to look like. And I found myself wondering if my great-great-grandmother would even recognize her homeland with the nuclear plant, the condos, and the 6 lanes of traffic that never stopped day or night. I wondered if she were here in the car with me, driving as the sun came up, if she'd feel home. It struck me at that moment that our nationhood, my nationhood, by its very nature, calls into question the system of settler colonialism, a system that is such an overwhelming, violent, normalized, and dishonest reality in Canada and so many other places. It is the force that has removed me or tried to remove me from my land. It has erased me from my history and from contemporary life, and it's the reason we currently have over 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. I wondered if my great-great-grandmother would be proud of me for figuring that out. I decided she wouldn't, because figuring out doesn't count for much if you're not willing to do something about it. When I arrived at the conference venue, several cups of coffee and 2 traffic jams later, I wasn't thinking about my grandmothers anymore. I was thinking about what I wanted for my own theoretical great-grandchildren. It was very simple. It is very simple. I want my great-grandchildren to be able to fall in love with every piece of our territory. I want their bodies to carry with them every story, every song, every piece of poetry hidden in our Anishinaabe language. I want them to be able to dance through their lives with joy. I want them to live without fear because they know respect, because they know in their bones what respect feels like. I want them to live without fear because they have a pristine environment with clean waterways that will provide them with the physical and emotional sustenance to uphold their responsibilities to the land, to their families, to their communities, and to their nations. I want them to be valued and heard and cherished by our communities and by Canada, no matter what their skin color, their physical and mental abilities, their sexual orientation, or their gender orientation. I want my great-great-grandchildren and their great-great-grandchildren to be able to live as Mississauga and Nishnaabeg, unharassed and undeterred in our homeland. The idea of my arms embracing my grandchildren and their arms embracing their grandchildren is communicated in the Anishinaabe word kobade. According to my elder Edna Manitowabi, kobade is a word we use to refer to both our great-grandparents and our great-grandchildren. It means a link in a chain between generations, between nations, between states of being, between individuals. I'm a link in a chain. We're all links in a chain. Doug Williams, a Mississauga Nishnaabeg elder from Curve Lake First Nation, calls our nation Kanien'kehá Nishnaabeg Ogaming, the place where we all live and work together. Our nation is a hub of Anishinaabe networks. It's a long kobade cycling through time. It is a web of connections to each other, to the plant nations, to the animal nations, the rivers and the lakes, the cosmos, and our neighboring indigenous nations. Kanien'kehá Nishnaabeg Ogaming is an ecology of intimacy. It's an ecology of relationships in the absence of coercion and hierarchy or authoritarian power. Kanien'kehá Nishnaabeg Ogaming is connectivity based on the sanctity of the land, the love that we have for our families, our language, our way of life. It is relationships based on deep reciprocity, respect, non-interference, self-determination, and freedom. Our nationhood is based on the idea that the earth is our first mother, that natural resources are not natural resources at all, but gifts from our mother. Our nationhood is based on the foundational concept that we should give up what we can to support the integrity of our homelands for the coming generations. We should give more than we take. It is nationhood based on a series of radiating responsibilities. This is what I understand our diplomats were negotiating when settlers first arrived in our territory. This was the impetus for those very first treaties: Anishinaabe freedom, protection from the land, for the land and the environment, a space, an intellectual, political, spiritual, artistic, creative, and physical space where we could live as Anishinaabe and where our Kobede could do the same. That is what my ancestors wanted for me, for us. They wanted our generation to be able to practice Anishinaabe governance over our homeland, to partner with other governments over shared land, to have the ability to make decisions about how the gifts of our mother would be used for the benefits of our people and in a manner that would promote her sanctity for the coming generations. I believe my ancestors expected the settler state to recognize my nation, our lands, and the political and cultural norms in our territory. But my nationhood just doesn't radiate outwards, it also radiates inwards. It's my physical body, my mind, and my spirit. It's our families, not the nuclear family that has been normalized in settler society, but big, beautiful, diverse, extended, multiracial families of relatives and friends that care very, very deeply for each other. This is the love of land, of family, of culture that is and was the spine of Idle No More, and that has always been the spine of Indigenous resistance and Indigenous resurgence. I think this is what motivates me to move forward and to continue to radically transform my relationship to Canada in a way that's based on mutual respect, justice, and accountability, because this is the ancient spine of my existence. That was story number 3 for those of you keeping track. The last story is on the screen in front of you, and it's a short video. Part of Islands of Decolonial Love is a series of poems, and the poems are works that I collaborated with Indigenous musicians, a tribe called Red, Chris Dirksen, Tara Williamson, Sean Conway, Nick Ferrio, Melody McIver, I think that's everybody, to create an album that's also called Islands of Decolonial Love, and you can download it or stream it from the ARP Books site for free. So that's why ARP Books is a great publisher, because they take a very liberal, broad view of what a book is. This piece is called Leaks. I wrote the poetry. Singer-songwriter Tara Williamson wrote the lyrics, and it's based on an event that happened to me and my daughter, Miniwewe Beneshi, when she was 5. We were out in our territory in May, and we were collecting wild leeks, and we ran into a very racist man. And this was the first experience my daughter had with racism, and she was extremely upset. She cried all the way home. It was really difficult for us to talk about it. I was sort of concerned as a mother because I wanted to support her and help her process this. But she sort of would burst into flames anytime that we approached the subject. So I started to get more worried, because that's what I do as a mom. And I started to talk about it with people, with women in my community. And I started to look for help, because I needed help to get Miniwe to sort of heal from this. And so Tara, actually, I was talking to her about it, and she suggested that maybe I should stop worrying about Miniwe and maybe I should process it for myself, and that maybe a good way for me to process it as a writer would be to write about it. And so that's how the poem came about. I then sent the poem to Tara, and she sent back a song. She wrote the music to the song. And we played it in Toronto and in Peterborough. We performed it a few times. And then we were approached by Cara Mumford, who is a Métis filmmaker, and she asked if she could make a film. And we agreed. We thought that that would be a good idea. Miniway is still ignoring me at this point, not able to talk, wondering why I'm trying to embarrass her all over town with my dumb poem. But Cara was wonderful, and she asked her mother, Mari Mumford, who is sort of the grandmother of Indigenous theatre in Canada, to help. And they came up with the idea of asking Miniway if she would dance in the film. And Miniway thought that that was a wonderful idea. So Rulan Tangen came from Santa Fe to work with Cara and Miniway. And over the course of 2 years, the women of my community took my daughter back to the spot where it happened. And through dance and poetry and music, Miniway helped make this film. And so for me, it was a really great lesson about why community is important, why art's important, and why women are important. And now what started out as a really horrible racist incident has turned into this piece, which screened at Imaginative a couple months ago.
Road, open windows, beautiful one, too perfect for this world. The immediacy of mosquitoes, humidity choking breath, my beautiful singing bird. 5-year-old Kitchener Clay, crying silent, petrified tears in the back seat until the dam finally bursts. You are the breath over the ice on the lake. You are the one the grandmothers sing to through the rapids. You are the saved seeds of allies. You are the space between embraces. She's always going to remember this. You are rebellion, resistance, reimagination. Her body will remember. You are dug-up roads, 27-day standoffs, the foil of industry prospectors. She can't speak about it for a year, which is 1/6 of her life. For every one of your questions, there's a story hidden in the skin of the forest. Use them as flint, fodder, love songs, medicine. You are from a place of unflinching power, the holder of our stories, the one who speaks up. The chants, the spoken of words drowned in ambush. You are not a vessel for white settler shame, even if I am the housing that failed you.
Well, Miigwech, you've been a fantastic audience. I think we have time for questions. Yeah? did everyone hear the question? So sort of Jason's asking if I could speak more about how I see theory and the link between the land and how that sort of propels itself. I think that before I did my master's and between my undergraduate degree and my master's, I had an opportunity where I spent a lot of time on the land with about 30 elders over a 2-year period. And what was really clear to me from that experience, it was one of those experiences that was really, really life-changing, and that I wish I hadn't been so young. I feel like it was wasted on me at 25. I would have got more out of it now. But what I realized is that when you don't take in theory and methodology and an intellectual framework, one emerges because there's one that's already there. Because Anishinaabe people, despite what we've been told by colonial society, are extremely intelligent, and our knowledge system is very complex and relational. And so theory for me comes from the land, and it comes from my relationship to the land. It's relational. It's a networked knowledge system, and it needs to be continually generated. So when I think of my ancestors, if they didn't get up and make a whole bunch of things, make really good relationships, make connection, make meaning, make food, make shelter, make transportation, make travel routes, make a system of governance, make a political system, then it didn't exist. And so they didn't have permanent buildings and institutions. Their way of being in the world was one that required everyone to be makers. And I think that has been pointed out to me a number of times in my life through artists, because artists are always continually engaged in a making process. And we often hear our elders say that our theories are really come from our creation stories and our origin stories. And if you want to know who you are as an Indigenous person, you need to understand that creation story, because that's about how to, it contains everything you need to know about life and how to live in it. And what's really prominent in creation stories is makers. So if I even go back one generation in my family, when I look at my mom and my grandmother going back 2 generations, they knew how to make everything. They made our clothes, they made our food, they were highly engaged. They got up every day and were engaged in a creative process. Well, what is the creation story? It's the theory of how the world was made. I think the creation story tells us that we're supposed to get up every day and we're supposed to create and we're supposed to make. We're not supposed to be consumers. We're not supposed to be shoppers. We're not supposed to buy everything. We're supposed to be engaged in this spiritual, metaphysical creation process. And so when I'm out on the land, that lesson becomes really, really animated for me. And being out on the land, my family has learned the process of making maple sugar and the process of wild rice. And so we try to do those things every year. And I think as those on-the-land processes deepen for me, I understand that I'm sort of deepening my relationships within that intelligence network, because I'm creating and I am embodying theory. I am animating it. And the more that you animate it and embody it in individuals and collective settings, the more you generate the intellectual. That's a long answer, sorry. Jaggy, I saw your hand go up. Well, of course I'm interested in everybody getting along better, and I'm interested in the sort of onslaught of colonial violence stopping. But I think that in terms of we're interested in reconciliation, we have to be talking about the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is land. So I worry that we're not talking about land, and I worry that we're not talking about bodies. And one of the ways that we're trying to talk about bodies, the Indigenous community is trying to talk about bodies right now, is through activism and pushing back against the 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women. So through colonial gender violence, because our queer community and our women have been very, very targeted in an ongoing way for the last 400 years. So those two issues, I think, have to be at the front. I think that if we're going to talk about reconciliation, we also have to talk about things like restitution and regeneration, because there's a lot of loss through this violence of colonialism. My language is a good example. We have 65 speakers left of my dialect, and they're all over the age of 60. That's the direct result of residential schools, but we're not talking about regenerating my language. We're not talking about regenerating my political system, my system of governance, the relationships that we have with the land. And so reconciliation, the way that it has come about through the federal government, is a very, very shallow way of trying to make things better. Well, really, I think just digging in the colonial system even further. So it feels like a little bit of a trick. It feels like a way of gutting Indigenous resistance to maintain the status quo. And I want to say a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because I think there are a lot of survivors that have lived through hell, and if any of them got any peace out of that, then I'm all for that, any healing or peace that comes out of that. But I think that when we talk about reconciliation on a broader scale, I don't think we're having the right conversations. Well, I think that my work has sort of focused on Indigenous resurgence and sort of looking towards Indigenous intelligence systems and political systems and artistic practices to regenerate ourselves. And I think you're right, Canada has a lot of decolonizing to do. I think that a lot of our original treaties were about reconciling two different worldviews, two different peoples. I think there's a lot of knowledge in how Indigenous peoples visioned the relationship. So I think that that's one area that we can all work on. I think that there's a tremendous number of local issues that Indigenous communities, whether they're urban or on the reserve, are dealing with. And I think that we need help in amplifying our voices. We need help in terms of creating communities of co-resistance and thinking critically about the system of settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy and how it's impacting all of us. So I think we need a lot more people that are sort of amplifying and supporting and creating their own communities of resistance. I think there's a lot of opportunity as well to build relationships between other communities of resistance. So I'm looking at Black Lives Matters right now and seeing a lot of commonalities and a lot of differences, but an opportunity for conversations that maybe hasn't existed before.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Do I have to say? I don't know who to say. I really, really appreciated the grace, the elegance of moving through different ways of telling a story. And I wonder if I could get you to say more about the side of education in Canada and the place that the sort of contradictory forces for thinking the kinds of complexities that you're talking about in the university system that we're standing in. I think that here in Montreal and in Quebec, the student strike really brought to the fore brought and highlighted something that you said about dreaming and being in the world, that we weren't asking, and the students weren't asking for cheaper tuition. They were asking for free education, for a whole different way of thinking. And yet, I know, and I'm sure as an academic, you know that when we, as teachers, come into a classroom and we try to bring more than one way of learning, the university is very quick to tell us that we're doing the wrong thing, that we're not preparing students in those funnels that the university really likes. And so, for me, I'm less and less sure that the university can do the work of learning that you're talking about, and I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, I quit my tenure track position about 15 years ago, so I've chosen to base my practice outside of the university system for all of those reasons. And I was a stay-at-home mom, and now I homeschool my 2 kids, and everyone's like, oh, that's so much work. And I feel like I have exactly the same amount of time to do research and writing as I did when I was in the system. So I'm not a huge fan of the academic industrial complex. I'm a huge fan of students. I learn a lot from my students, and I'm a huge fan of creating alternatives outside of the university education system. I came through the system in the 1990s because I'm 450 years old, and there were no Indigenous academics in it at that time, and there were no Indigenous people really at the university. That's changed very quickly, and we now have a large network of Indigenous academics, but it's still very, very difficult for us to bring the kinds of things into the system that our communities need. I think it's critically important that we create generations of people that can think with inside Indigenous intelligence systems. That's not happening at universities. We're creating, to some degree, people with skills that can go back into our communities and do the other work on their own. And we're creating generations of people that can critique the colonial system. But I think that we need generations of people that can think and dream and vision and do and make with inside Anishinaabe intelligence systems. And that's not going to be state funded, and that you're not going to get paid to do that. But if we don't do that work, I don't think we're going to exist in a few generations. So I'm trying to think of something more hopeful to say. Sorry.
Maybe to follow up, just talk a little bit about the Concordia University and you're involved with that community diversity transition between the two.
Yeah, I'm involved with Dechinta, which is a Bush university, the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning in Denendeh, which is in the Northwest Territories. So it's a Dene program, which centers Dene intelligence and Dene knowledge systems in the program. It's accredited by the University of Alberta, and it brings critical Indigenous studies into the bush, I guess, because the bush is our classroom. And so they offer semester programs for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in the Northwest Territories that are on the land and that center that. So it's sort of using what we've been calling a critical Indigenous place-based pedagogy. And so that program has been a really amazing program to be a part of, and I do think that there's some hope in terms of making the shift, I think, that needs to happen. And you know how it happened was Dene people got together, said we don't have a university, we don't have any kind of institutions that are promoting our knowledge system and that are generating the kinds of people that we need to generate in order to be Dene. So they got together, set up this organization, and then developed partnerships with University for Accreditation. So it's a pretty interesting model. Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. I don't think she's asking about using art as a way of processing trauma and bringing about a catharsis. And so I'm sort of started as an academic. I'm a recovering academic. And so for most of my life, I've existed in my head. And once I had, giving birth, you can't do that just in your head, although I tried. And so that was a really life-changing thing for me because my body, I noticed my body. And then through raising children, they're very active and they're very kinetic and they learn by doing and they learn by running around and being very, very engaged. And in Peterborough, we have a pretty strong Indigenous arts community. So I started a language nest where our Nishnaabeg families were learning the language through the arts because it felt like you weren't learning at all. It didn't feel like school, so people were really excited about that. And by bringing artists in, I ended up participating in dance workshops and performance workshops. And I started to notice that performance in particular is a really powerful way of creating a little island of decolonial love. And maybe it's only for 5 minutes, or maybe it's only for 30 seconds. But really masterful performers, like Rebecca Belmore in this regard, can sort of transform space and time in a really interesting way. And so I felt healed and inspired and angry and radical. And I felt like, oh, this is what resurgence feels like. This is what rebellion feels like. How do we sort of knit these together? How do we build on this? Because I think we have to. The bad part of, well, there's a lot of bad parts about being occupied and colonized, but I don't think we even know what freedom feels like. And so I think one of the other things that artists do is create these little bubbles where you can feel it and where you recognize it. And so it's a powerful act of self-recognition as well. But I sort of haven't written about that yet. So there's a little bit of that in Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. But it's an interesting question. Thanks.
I wanted to thank you so much for your beautiful film and your daughter, that story. That, of course, made me cry because I'm a mother of three grown teenage children. I don't know how much they're touched by this racism, but I know it's ever present in their lives. And when we talk about reconciliation, it's so powerful. And so I have one question. Because for women, it's easy for us to support each other. Somehow we find ways. But I'm so worried about our boys.
So what's the question?
How can we as women, who are so, I think, really good with our girls, or we find ways and we work at it, how can we find ways of better supporting our boys in a world that's just so mean?
Well, I think that I know a lot of very radical, feminist, anti-patriarchal, anti-heteropatriarchal Indigenous men that are really great examples for my son and that are doing some really excellent work, that are excellent fathers, and that are excellent community members. And I can think about, when I look at in my life, I can think of examples from all genders of that. And so I think that it's really important, I guess, for me as a mother of a son to present that and to bring those friends and those relatives into his life in a powerful way. And I also think it's really important to connect with boys and girls and people who don't fit into those categories in a really meaningful way, because I think that I've learned, I think my children and youth and my students have been really the greatest teachers of my life. And I think this idea that, because I'm middle-aged, that I somehow have some sort of knowledge is a little bit crazy. And so I think that that boys and youth and all genders actually, if we sit down and listen in an open and honest way think about how we can undo some of the systems of oppression in a good way. I think that model for me is something that's been powerful and life-changing.
Maybe time for one more question. Okay. Or maybe a hand. Okay. So if we can just flip Leanne Simpson.
There's a story hidden in the skin of the forest. Use them as flint, fodder, love songs, medicine. You are from a place of unflinching power, the holder of our stories, the one who speaks up. The chance for spoken up words drowned in ambush. You are not a vessel for white settler shame, even if I am the housing that failed you.